Let me begin, actually, from the beginning by introducing you to somebody who, in some ways, would have been or should have been the cause of this material. This was Amos Tversky a few years before he died, and you can see a very distinguished gentleman. And obviously very smart and brilliant and so on. And this is Amos Tversky as he looked when he and I did our work. And this is, I like showing this picture because it does several things. I think it reminds you of how innovative science is really done, and it's done having a lot of fun. We were exceptionally lucky because we had fun together, so we liked each other's company, and we spent about 5 or 6 hours a day together for many years, just having fun, basically, and doing the research that led to the material that I'll be talking about today. I'll be talking about two modes of thinking. Obviously, the fast and the slow, and I'll associate two names with them, the System 1 and System 2, and let me illustrate one way that thoughts come to mind. So, you know, this lady is angry, and notice how that happened to you. And I use the word happened advisedly. You didn't have to compute, you didn't have to have an intention, she just looks angry. If I say 2 plus 2, a number comes into your head. It comes into your head immediately. You don't have to intend, you don't have to make an effort, it happens. So there are many thoughts, impressions, beliefs, emotions that have that character. They come to mind unbidden, and we feel passive with respect to them. It's something that happens. Mostly, as phenomena I'll talk about, happen in a place, in the brain. They happen in a system, and that system is the associative memory system. 2 plus 2 is very strongly associated with the number 4, and so you hear 2 plus 2, and the number 4 pops up in your mind. And this lady brings anger. And here is another way that thoughts come to your mind. So, well, actually, let's analyze what came to your mind here, because no number came to your mind, you know, unless you have misspent your youth learning too much of the multiplication table. You know, nothing comes to mind, but you immediately recognize, there's a lot actually that you knew very quickly. You immediately recognize that as a multiplication system. You probably knew about yourself, something about yourself, whether you could do it in your head or couldn't. And there were a few other things actually that you knew, because you knew that very roughly a range of possible answers. So you knew it was less than 25,000, and you knew it was more than 75. So somewhere, and that happened. But the number, which happens to be 408, for those of you who are very curious about such things, that number didn't come to mind. To produce it, you would have to do something entirely different from what I described so far. To produce it, you'd have to retrieve a program that you learned in high school, and you'd have to run that program. And that program is sequential, and it involves finding, you know, products and storing them, and then going back and finding more products and remembering where you are. This is hard work. And so the second type of thinking that I'll talk about is effortful. The first type is automatic, it happens by itself. The second type is typically associated with a sense of agency. You feel you're doing it. You feel you're the author of those thoughts that come into your head. And there is something else that System 2 does. In effect, it controls, or it is in control. What is deliberate, most of us, by the way, we feel we are our System 2. We don't know much about what's going on in our System 1, in the associative system, because so much of it happens very quickly and outside the reach of awareness. But System 2, we're normally aware of what's going on, of that second mode of thinking, and we're aware of the work that is being done. By the way, the work is actual work. It consumes glucose in the brain, and it's associated with consumes an unusual, a remarkable amount of work, glucose in the brain apparently, and it's associated with many physiological manifestations. So if you were to compute, to really try to compute 17 times 24, your heart rate would increase by several beats, your pupil would dilate, possibly by 40 or 50% of its initial area. So that's what mental work is like. Now, to give you a general view of how they work, those two systems, you might think that system 2 is in charge, because that, in effect, is how I've described it, because we can inhibit thoughts, and we certainly can inhibit actions. So, you don't tell everyone everything you think about them. You monitor, and sometimes you stop yourself, or you adjust what you were going to say. You sometimes even stop yourself from going along a certain path of thoughts. So you deliberately turn your thoughts away from a topic and move to another. So in that sense, all these are system 2. All these are deliberate and effortful, and they involve some mental work. So in that sense, system 2 would appear to be in control. But the picture that I draw, and that I will sort of elaborate on in the remainder of our time, the picture is a little more complex, because I will describe system 2 basically as lazy, as doing as little as it can. And we have a lot of evidence that system 2 is lazy, and I'll give you some evidence. Actually, I'll give you some evidence now. Okay, this is a riddle. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Don't try to solve it, because that's not the point. The point is that a solution came to your mind immediately, and that solution was 10 cents. The number 10 cents occurred to you. It occurs to everybody when they first see that problem. It is not the correct solution to the problem. The correct solution, by the way, is 5 cents, because sometimes I completely lose the audience at this point. But so it's 5 cents. It's 5 cents, and $1.05 gives you $1.10. But 10 cents and $1.10 gives you $1.20. So 10 cents is wrong, but it occurs to everybody. And then there is an interesting fact. When you present that riddle to students at universities, about 50% of students at Princeton, Harvard, and Yale, and MIT actually, say 10 cents. And we learn something very important about the people who say 10 cents, because anyone who writes 10 cents has not checked. Because if you check, it's immediate that 10 cents is the wrong answer. So if you put down 10 cents, as and in some universities that will remain nameless, it gets to 85% who fail this item. So Princeton and is actually quite good in that respect. But we know that anyone who makes that mistake hasn't checked. It tells us something about system 2. It tells us, and that's very typical of what happens, that system 1 came up with an answer, pretty much like 2 plus 2 equals 4, but in this case, the answer was wrong. And system 2 endorsed it and passed it on and expressed it in overt behavior, in the kinds of thing that system 2 controls. So that is roughly the picture of the mind, as I'm going to describe it. And it means something. It means that we want to know what are the immediate inclinations. We want to know how system 1 works. That is, what does it come up with in different situations? And then we want to know how system 2 works, in the sense of when will system 2 not endorse, because endorsing is the default mode. When will system 2 not endorse the impressions, the immediate associations of system 1? We'll also see, as we develop that scheme, where errors come from. We'll see, first of all, before I talk of errors, let me talk about what system 1 does extremely well. Most of our skilled behavior is in system 1. It's automatic. So if you drive, you can talk and drive at the same time. You can't have a serious conversation while you're making a left turn into traffic. That is demanding of effort, and a characteristic of effort and a characteristic of system 2 is that its overall capacity is limited. So if it's employed or deployed in one task, it is not available for the performance of other tasks. So that's a characteristic how that works. Our skills, we admire skills and the intuitions of experts a lot. Many people here have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, where people have intuitions and experts have intuitions. And it is indeed the fact. Experts do have intuitions, which are often very impressive. That is, when you see a chess master, walk past a position and say, white mates in 3 or something, the chess master views or sees chess situations differently from the rest of us. That comes from reinforced practice. And with reinforced practice, skill develops. This is how we learn how to take a turn on the road without really thinking. That is, there are cues, and those cues directly activate a motor response, through the memory system, but automatically, and we don't have to invest effort in them. Now, we admire the skills of experts, but all of us are skilled. We are skilled at most of the things that we do. So we're skilled at driving, but we're also skilled at talking, at chatting leisurely. My first, actually, I think, the first time that I thought along these lines was a very long time ago, when I was studying what the pupil of the eye does when people are engaged in mental effort. Turns out the pupil dilates enormously with mental effort, but I was once watching, we had a setup that displayed the pupil of the eye in the corridor of the laboratory, and you could see that thing pulsing and increasing in diameter when people were thinking or were working. And somebody had stayed in the chin rest with her pupil being imaged during a break in the experiment. And she was sort of chatting with other people in the laboratory. And I was really stunned, I remember, because very little happened to her pupil. So it turns out she was chatting and not working. Her mind was not doing very much work at all, but she was chatting entirely normally. So remembering 6 digits, parking, in a narrow space, except possibly, for garage attendants, but filling a tax form, all of these are hard work. Chatting, it turns out, just responding routinely without thinking very much, that is a skill we have. That comes off almost automatically and essentially does not demand effort. Now, I have a purpose for doing this. Let me focus, you have already focused on those words, and let me tell you a few things that happened to you while you were looking at these words, because they are very characteristic of how System 1 works. In the first place, you read the words. You didn't have control over that. You knew what the words were immediately. So reading is, in that sense, so highly skilled that it is automatic. You tell people not to read, and unless you really direct their attention elsewhere, they're going to read the words. Now, images came to your mind, and the images were not nice. And something else happened. You made a disgust face, and mildly, but you made a disgust face. And we know what a disgust face looks like, and you can show pictures of people's faces when they have seen that one word, and that's the response. You felt some disgust, mild, not like the real thing, but a mild replica of the real thing. You moved. That's hard to believe because you didn't sense yourself moving, but it can actually be measured, and it has been measured in recent years. So people recoil when they see a threatening word. Now, an interesting aspect of this, which has been very influential in my own thinking in this context, is that most of these responses tend to reinforce each other. That is, you get a coherent response because of that mutual reinforcement. What do I mean by this? When you feel disgust, you make a disgust face. But when you make a disgust face, you feel disgust. So the influences go both ways. And we know that from many different experiments, but one of my favorite ones involves taking a pencil and sticking the pencil in your mouth like this. And then you show people cartoons. And the cartoons are funny. They're funnier than they are normally for somebody who holds a pencil like this. They give higher ratings to how funny the cartoons are. And the reason is that although they're not aware that anything is funny, they're making a funny face. They're making a smile. And you force people to make a smile by sticking a pencil in their mouth in this direction. You stick a pencil in their mouth in this direction, that makes a frown. And then cartoons are less funny than usual. So we have influences that work both ways, and what you begin to get here is a reaction to the word, which is a bit of a replica of the reaction to the real thing. Something else happens to you when, well, many other things happen, but when you see this, it changes the activity in your associative memory in a very interesting way. Suppose after seeing this pair of words, you were exposed to a tape with whispered words that are very difficult to recognize. So most of the words sounds just like a whisper, undistinguishable. But some words would sound loud and clear. You would recognize them very easily. And these would be words like smell and stink and ill and hangover and nausea and a lot of words that are related to vomit. What happens is that single stimulus activates a whole range of ideas in your associative memory. You're not conscious of them. They don't actually come to your mind, but you're prepared for them. And because you're prepared for them, you will react more quickly if a word is exposed plainly, and you will react to a word that is presented faintly. You will respond to it as if it had been presented more clearly because you are ready for it. So what happens, and it happens really within a second when you see the word vomit. I haven't spoken of bananas yet, but what happens when you see that single word, you are prepared. You're in a state, you're prepared for emergency, you're prepared in a particular direction. By the way, people after that word will be generally more vigilant for a while because they have responded as if this were a threat. Now there's something else that happens, and that's the word banana here. The two words, as I show them here, are really not linked. There is no reason for you to make up a story. But system one, the automatic system, makes up a story out of these two words. And it makes up a causal story. The banana caused the vomit. And, for a short time, you're off bananas because they have that effect. It won't last long, but this connection has been made. And what happens, and this is quite a general theme when we talk about the two systems, is that system one is a storyteller. It generates interpretations, fairly complete interpretations, which, if possible, include a cause. When no cause is found, it's a problem. And that cause, in general, will bring about system two. Here, there is a possible cause. It's not that the cause is obvious, but it's the only candidate cause that is present, and a causal connection is clearly made between those two words. So you have a reaction that interprets the past, interprets the present, and prepares for the future. All of this happening within a fraction of a second, and without your intending to do anything. This is what associative memory does. This is what System 1 does. So it provides a coherent interpretation and a potential response to events. Now let me give you a few characteristics of System 1. All right. You read that, that's obvious. You read that, pretty obvious too. So I showed you ABC, I showed you 12, 13, 14. Some of you may know what's coming next. What's coming next is that the B and the 13 are exactly the same. They're precisely the same shape. So now you can see it. Those are the B's. Now, what happened here? What this is telling us an important fact about System 1. It really produces a coherent interpretation. So in the context of letters, that shape is read as a letter. In a context of numbers, it is read as a number. You don't intend to do that. This is just something that happens. And it happens automatically. And it happens because, if you will, of the tendency of that system to produce coherence. Now, while I'm talking about the marvels of System 1, it contains our world knowledge. And it represents our world knowledge. And I have an example that I cite all the time. And it's also in the book, actually. It's an experiment in which people listen to sentences. Well, events in their brain are recorded. And they hear a sentence spoken in an upper-class British male voice, which I will not try to imitate. And it says, "I have large tattoos all down my back." Within approximately 3/10 of a second, the brain responds, surprise. And there is a characteristic signature to the surprise response, and it's full-blown within a fraction of a second. Now, if you stop to think about it, this is pretty wonderful, because the associative memory has computed that it has recognized the voice as an upper-class British male voice. It has consulted its world knowledge about upper-class British males. It has found that not many of them have large tattoos down their back. It's not a typical behavior for upper-class British male. Incongruity is detected, a surprise. That happens immediately. So one of the major functions of System 1 is to use our world knowledge so that we are prepared for events in the world. And we can classify events in the world as they happen, as normal or abnormal. Now, I want to show you something else that System 1 does. This is an experiment, results of an experiment that was conducted in England in a laboratory, actually not a psychology laboratory, where there is an honesty box that's very common in British universities. There is a little room with tea and coffee and milk available, and biscuits, and an honesty box where people pay for the tea they buy. Somebody had the bright idea of hanging posters right on top of the honesty box. And you read that graph from the bottom. So this is the amount that people paid in pounds per liter of milk the first week. The poster of those two large eyes staring at you, they really pay a lot. The next week it's flowers. The next week it's eyes. The next week it's flowers again. This is a very powerful effect on behavior of something that nobody registered. It's absurd. I mean, you know, why? There is a connection, and this is really the way that system works, the associative system. It is highly symbolic in its responses. There is a connection between eyes being watched and a tendency to behave rather well, rather better than usual, to be wary. People are completely unaware of it. There were no awareness that people didn't know that there were posters, or probably they did know that there was a poster. They had no idea what the posters were, or that they would change, or the significance of the eyes. The effect still occurred. So this is system one. I'm just giving you a vague sense, but I hope I'm giving you the flavor of that pretty marvelous machinery we have in our head that generates a lot of our behavior, a lot of it without our being aware of what is happening and without our having the sense that we are doing it. System 2 is the one that made the contribution, but the impulse to make the contribution, that came clearly from System 1 without any awareness of what was going on. Now, you may be wondering how, I have the reputation of being very interested in errors, so you may be wondering, when am I finally going to talk about errors? How does System 1 go wrong? And I think, well, there's more than one answer, but I'll give you what I consider one of the important parts of the answer. When System 1, when asked a single question, and it can be asked from the outside, or it can be a question that you generate for yourself, that is, you develop the goal of finding an answer to a question. If the question is too difficult, System 1 answers a simpler one. That is, what happens is typically we don't compute when we face a question. We don't compute a single answer. Many computations go on. I call that the mental shotgun. It's not a single bullet. It's just many pellets are sent. Many computations go on. I'll give you an example of that. Suppose you are told to respond as quickly as possible if a pair of words rhyme. So you will, you raise one hand, say if the words rhyme, and the other hand if the words don't rhyme. And psychologists do that kind of thing, and they measure the speed at which people respond. So I say vote, note. That's very easy. Those two words rhyme. I say vote, goat. Those two words rhyme. People are much slower saying that they rhyme. Now why? It is because they have carried out a computation that nobody asked them to carry out, that they did not intend to carry out. They spell the words. They spell the words, and there is a mismatch in the spelling between vote and goat. That creates a no response, a tendency to answer no. That's a mismatch, which interferes with the response that you really intend to produce, which is a response to whether the words rhyme or not. That is highly typical. We generate answers to multiple questions immediately in our head when we're asked a single one, in many cases. And in some cases, the answer to the correct question doesn't come up at all. You're never aware of it, but the answer to another question comes up. If people are asked the question, how tall are the three figures, how large are the three figures on the screen? This experiment has been run many times. People think the figure on the right is larger than the figure on the left on the screen. It is not. If you took a ruler, the three figures are absolutely identical. What happens is we answer a question that we're not asked to answer. We compute the three-dimensional size of those figures, not on the screen, but if this were a three-dimensional image, who would be taller? It's the guy on the right. And that's what happens. Now, people are not confused. You know that you've been asked to think about the screen, but there is another answer, which is quite powerful, and it distorts what you will say to that direct question. Here is another example of the same kind of mechanism of answering a question because the answer to a simpler one is available. So this was done with students, and in a survey, students were asked two questions in immediate succession. How happy are you? And how many dates did you have last month? When people are asked those two questions in that sequence, they're essentially uncorrelated. Turns out dating is not what determines students' happiness. Now you invert the order of the questions. So you ask them, how many dates did you have last month? How happy are you? Now the correlation jumps to 0.66. It's very, very high. In effect, what they do, the question, how happy are you, is a difficult question. But they have an answer. There is an answer available in System 1. You have the question, how many dates did you have last month, created an emotional response, which presumably is a happy one if you had many, and is not a happy one if you didn't have any. And so that emotional tone is available. When the question, how happy are you, comes up, that's the answer that gets generated. So we call that the substitution principle. And the substitution principle means that you answer a question that is simpler than the one you're asked. This happens all over the place. And in effect, it serves us extremely well, because much of the time, there'll be a relationship. You'll answer not exactly the question you were asked, but you'll do something. You won't be stumped. System 1 is rarely stumped. It produces something most of the time. 17 times 24, no, but in many other cases, yes. Let me give you an example. I'm trying to remember the Canadian grading system, but which I should know because I taught at UBC for 8 years. But let me tell you about a student. Her name is Julie, and I'll give you one fact about Julie. She read fluently when she was age 4. And I ask you, what is her grade point average? And the odd thing is, like in the other cases that I mentioned, a number came to your mind. Your mind produced a number. It's the wrong number, by the way. But let me explain how the number came to your mind. The fact Julie read fluently when she was age 4 creates an impression. You have an impression of how bright she is. Actually, how bright she is something else. You have an impression of how precocious she was in acquiring reading. She was quite precocious. Not exceptionally precocious. Some people read at age 2 or less, but quite precocious. So you have some vague idea. It's not very precise, but you have an idea of, in percentile terms, how many people read earlier than age 4? Not many. What did you do with the question, what is her grade point average? You actually matched the percentile. You produced an answer, a grade point average, which is about as extreme as your impression of her grade point average. That's the way intuition works. It is absurd. Actually, you know very, very little about Julie. One fact. But you predict, in effect, as if the correlation between reading age and grade point average was perfect. It is not perfect. You know virtually nothing about Julie. You should stay very close to the average in predicting her grade point average. In statistical terms, you should be very regressive. Our intuitions are completely non-regressive. This is a major characteristic of System 1. It is extremely poor at dealing with statistics. And it is prone to tell stories, and the stories are told, the stories are generated even with very little information. So you get one fact about Julie, and you have an idea. I'll give you another example. Steve is a meek and tidy soul with a passion for detail. Now, Steve has been selected at random from the population of Canada. What is the probability that Steve is a librarian rather than a farmer? Now, one fact jumps immediately to mind, which is Steve looks like a librarian. the stereotype, the match of the stereotypes comes immediately to mind. There is a bit of statistics that's relevant here. I know the statistics for the United States. For Canada, it would be more extreme. In the United States, there are 20 times as many male farmers as male librarians. So in effect, any calculation that is sensible, Steve is significantly more likely to be a farmer than a librarian, even though he is a meek and tidy soul. There are many meek and tidy souls among farmers, not only among librarians. That's the way a correct system would compute it. Our intuitive system does not. So it tells a story even when there is little information. Furthermore, the confidence we have in that story, in those stories, is determined by how coherent they are, by how much sense you can make of the information and the conclusion. If it's a coherent story, we believe it. If we have difficulty generating a story, we doubt. System 1 produces the most coherent story possible. The result is massive overconfidence. Why? Because we are really good storytellers. We tell ourselves stories with very little information. And if the stories are good, we believe them. System 2 believes them. And the result is that System 2 has much greater belief in its opinions, its belief, the correctness of its decisions than it really should have. And that is because of the way that System 1 works. So let me wrap up and open this up to questions. During a period, this study was done in the 1990s, not by me, and that was during a period where there was significant terrorist activity in Europe, and people were asked to actually imagine that they were traveling, and were asked how much they would be willing to pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case of death for any reason. Okay? Other people were asked, how much would you pay for insurance that pays $100,000 in case of death in a terrorist accident? Well, I got that backward. But the first one was in a terrorist incident. The second one is death for any reason. Can you guess what happened? People pay a lot more for the second insurance than for the first. Now, this is ridiculous because, let me not elaborate why it's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. But what happens is very simple. We don't, it's a very difficult question, how much you pay for insurance. But there is something that comes to your mind readily. How afraid am I? And people are more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than they're afraid of dying. And that makes perfect sense. The idea that you will die on a trip, that feels quite remote. The idea that you will die in a terrorist incident, that's a vivid image of explosions and mangled bodies and so on, and people pay more for insurance. So this is the way that System 1 will violate logic. I'm done, almost. I've described two systems. System 2 is nominally in charge, but System 1 really is the hero of the story, because System 2 typically endorses what System 1 suggests. This arrangement is marvelous, and it is flawed. It is marvelous because System 1 is marvelous. System 2 is so-so, by the way. I mean, it's slow, and it's clanky, and it's lazy, and it has limited capacity. And it usually doesn't know statistics, so that it endorses the mistakes suggested by System 1. But that's the arrangement. It's marvelous, and it is flawed because very often the answers that System 1 generates are not the correct answers. And even when they are not the correct answers, they are likely to be endorsed by System 2. So that's basically, well, I still would like you to read the book, but that's basically, that's basically what the book is about. Thank you.
Is there a way to target a system to learn?
Okay. Very difficult. There are two things about System 1. It's very difficult to change its mode of operation. You know, you're not going, the associations are where they are, and it's very easy to update System 1. That is, you can update what you know about the world. I have a story to tell that I love to, I'll tell you the story and steal 2 minutes from you. But it's instructive about System 1. We're on a vacation in Australia, my wife and I, on a resort, just 40 rooms in the resort, and that evening we meet a colleague from Stanford. And, you know, what a coincidence, we're all very surprised and so on. And 2 weeks later, we're in London at the theater, the lights go off, somebody comes and sits next to me, and the light comes back on, it's John from Stanford, the same guy. And what is instructive about System 1 is that I was much less surprised the second time than the first. Because John, you know, my System 1 had already concluded, John, that's the guy I meet all over the place. Now, if I had met anyone else, I would have been much more surprised. That would have been, although that would have been less of a coincidence. So that's the way that System 1 can learn. By and large, if you want to improve your thinking, it's by improving System 2, it's by learning statistics, and it's by using System 2, which is that when the stakes are very high, you want to slow down. You can't use System 2 all the time because it's too slow, inefficient, and costly. You must go on relying on your intuitions, but when the stakes are high.
To what extent do different individuals have different things in Systems 1 and System 2, and to what extent is this valuable?
Is it valuable, you said? Yes. There are individual differences in System 2. In part, one range of individual differences is in intelligence. So System 2 is correlated with intelligence, and all the standard intelligence tests, or most of the standard intelligence tests, are tests of the abilities of System 2. We don't have, more is the pity, we don't have tests of the intelligence of System 1 that are systematic and useful. Another aspect of System 2, where there are large individual differences, is the amount of self-control. And that is a very significant characteristic, and it's, by the way, related to that bat and ball test that I mentioned earlier. The people who fail that test, and many others like it, are different from the people who check themselves in quite predictable and interesting ways.
Front row.
Hi, my name is Venk. A question about whether or not you've seen any brain imaging studies relate to whether or not System 1 or System 2 is activated, whether an MRI or anything like that?
Well, I doubt very much. Okay, there is an apology I should make. I don't believe that there are systems. It's just a language. I call that a psychodrama between two fictitious characters, because it's much easier to think of System 1 and System 2 than to think about sentences like mental arithmetic is effortful and causes pupils to dilate. So when you say System 2 does mental arithmetic and you have the general idea of what System 2 is, it's just easier to store. So they're not systems. System 1, I'm not sure, maps onto anything in particular in the brain. I mean, just too many operations of the brain are automatic. System 2, apparently, there is now a lot of research on localizations of System 2. And the same system seems to be involved in moral reasoning and moral behavior, and in checking yourself, and in making yourself compute, and in the control of attention. And so this is happening. There are several systems that seem to be shared between these.
My question is that I see people sometimes who answer questions very quickly,
And I see other people who they'll pause and think about it, and in fact, they're a little annoying. And I'm wondering if people actually have that characteristic of ignoring and controlling system one.
I mean, my guess would be that you're right, that the people who pause are figuring out whether they really want to do what came to their mind, whereas other people say what came to their mind without wondering about it. My guess is you're right, but
Patrick Sue, I was wondering if you would associate system 1 and system 2 with different parts of the brain, like the old part and the new part?
I don't think that system 1 could be just the old part of the brain. It includes the old part of the brain in the sense that we share part of system 1 with animals. I mean, emotions are clearly within system 1. Emotions are experienced as something that happens to us. Many innate tendencies, fear of spiders, that's in system 1. Perception is in system 1. But on the other hand, driving is also system 1. And, talking is system 1. So it's not in a single place. System 2, as I mentioned earlier, is much more likely to be localized, and we know a bit about its localization.
Last question, front row.
My name is Janine Gleaner. This may be a related question. In marketing, we often craft messages with a logical benefit as well as an emotional appeal. Are we really working with System 2 and System 1 when we do that?
That's the idea, I would think. By and large, it's very clear that marketing and political speech are mostly directed at System 1. And they're intended to evoke emotional responses and tendencies to react in particular directions. Some people, the more educated people, I think, tend to prefer advertisements that are targeted, that involve some thinking or require some thinking or provide some information. So what you're talking about is an ad that attempts to talk to both systems at once. And we have those too. Thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.